She stepped into the elegant restaurant, her eyes scanning the cozy interior, hoping for a quiet meal after a long day of work. But before she could reach the hostess stand, the sharp voice of the receptionist stopped her. "We don't serve customers dressed like that." A cold, dismissive glance followed, sending waves of humiliation through her. She opened her mouth to protest, but the manager arrived quickly, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If you're not a VIP, please leave. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you." Nina stood in front of the small, dimly lit restaurant, wiping the moisture from her brow with the back of her hand. She had worked a long shift at the grocery store, standing behind the register, ringing up endless amounts of groceries for customers who barely glanced up to acknowledge her. Another day of being invisible. Another day of quietly playing the part of the forgotten worker. But tonight, she needed a moment of peace. A quiet place where she could pretend for a little while that she wasn't just a shadow in the background. The restaurant had always seemed like a welcoming place. It wasn't the fanciest in town, but there was something warm about the flickering candles on each table and the soft hum of conversation around. Nina wasn't looking for anything special, just a meal, a cup of coffee, and a few minutes to herself. She hadn't eaten much today, too tired to care about food when she was too busy trying to stay afloat. As she pushed open the door, the gentle jingle of the bell above it was the only sound to greet her. The host, a young man who barely looked up from his phone, glanced over at her, then quickly down at his screen again. Nina stepped forward, already feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders, but hopeful that tonight might be different. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but clear. "I'd like a table for one." The host didn't respond immediately. He merely looked her up and down with a brief, appraising gaze, as though measuring her worth by something unspoken. It made her uneasy, but she chalked it up to her exhaustion. She forced a polite smile, hoping he'd acknowledge her request. After a moment, he glanced at her again. This time, his eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned forward. "Sorry, we don't serve people dressed like you," he said, his tone cold, dismissive. Nina's face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. What?" she asked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She was wearing an old sweater, worn jeans, and her scuffed boots. Nothing unusual, nothing to be ashamed of. But for some reason, in that moment, she felt completely out of place, as though she had done something wrong by simply entering. He gave her an indifferent glance. "If you're not a VIP, then I suggest you find somewhere else to eat," he said, a trace of disdain in his voice. It hit her like a punch to the stomach. She could feel the blood rushing to her face, a mixture of anger and humiliation. The words stung deeply, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they were simple and deliberate. She had been made to feel like nothing, unworthy of a basic human interaction. And for what? Because of the way she dressed? Because she didn't have the right to be in the same space as the important people? Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was calm, firm, with an air of authority. Nina turned to see the restaurant's manager approaching, his eyes locking onto hers, then shifting to the host. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a moment that felt like it lasted far longer than it should have. The host stepped aside, almost immediately, as though relieved to be rid of the responsibility. The manager, a man in his mid-40s with a neatly trimmed beard, looked her over with a practiced gaze. "I'm sorry about that. We try to keep a certain standard here." His voice was smooth, too smooth, as if rehearsed. "But if you're not a VIP, we have to ask you to leave." Nina stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Was she invisible, or was it simply that she wasn't worthy of this place? In that moment, all the tiredness she'd carried with her seemed to collapse, leaving behind only the raw feeling of injustice. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. What could she say? What was the point? She was just one more person who didn't fit into the box they had made for people like her. And who would listen to her anyway? She was no one. But as she turned to leave, something inside her stirred, a quiet, tentative voice in the back of her mind, telling her she couldn't just let this slide. Not this time. Not again. Nina walked out of the restaurant, her head held high despite the rush of emotions she couldn't process. She didn't look back, but a small part of her knew that this moment, this small act of cruelty, would linger far longer than it should. She had no idea how, but in that moment, she realized something. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about this instance. This tiny wrong. It was bigger than that. She didn't know what would come next, but she could already feel it building inside her. Something was changing, something she couldn't ignore anymore. Noi Dung Chuang 1 Quang 4.000 Key 2. Van Fong Doi Thuong. Cam Suk. Nina sat on the worn-out bench outside the convenience store, her tired hands clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The steam no longer rose from the mug, and neither did any warmth from the world around her. It had been a long day. Just like every other, the customers came and went in a blur, their eyes seldom meeting hers, their words barely more than a mumbled thank you. If even that, she was just another face behind the counter. Another person who didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. The weight of it all had begun to press down harder lately. The life of a cashier was unremarkable, uneventful, and it felt like she was invisible. She had long since stopped hoping for any meaningful interactions, let alone any acknowledgement from the people who passed through her day. The hours stretched on endlessly, each shift blending into the next. But the truth was, it wasn't just the job that had drained her. It was the way the world seemed to look at her, always with a hint of judgment. Always assuming she was less than she was. The small apartment she shared with her younger brother was barely enough to live in. But it was all she had. She had left her family back in Mexico years ago, chasing a dream that had turned out to be nothing more than an illusion. The job at the store paid the bills. Just barely, but it never felt like enough. Nothing ever felt like enough. She thought about the incident at the restaurant earlier in the day. The words still echoed in her mind. Uninvited, unwelcome. If you're not a VIP, then I suggest you find somewhere else to eat. The coldness in the manager's voice made her feel smaller than she already did. It wasn't just about the incident. It was the reminder that no matter how hard she tried, she would always be seen as less. Less than the people who ate in that restaurant. Less than the people who wore fancy clothes. Less than everyone else, simply because she was who she was. Nina shook her head and pushed the thoughts aside. She could feel the familiar knot tightening in her chest. That lump of frustration and sadness that had taken residence inside her for as long as she could remember. But she couldn't afford to sit here and dwell on it, not now. She had to keep going. But as she sat there, her eyes drifting over the busy street, a voice inside her began to rise. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't let that man's words define her. Couldn't let his judgment be the final word in her life. The truth was, she was tired of being silent. She was tired of letting the world walk all over her. Tired of pretending that she didn't care about the things that mattered to her. She had spent so many years just trying to keep her head down. To avoid the judgment, to fit in, to survive. But somewhere along the way, she had lost her voice. And tonight, for the first time in years, it felt like that voice was beginning to stir again. She had walked away from the restaurant earlier, but the injustice still burned inside her. What if she hadn't walked away? What if she had said something? What if she had stood up for herself? For the people like her? She wasn't asking for the world to change, but she was tired of accepting a world that was so clearly broken. The small acts of discrimination that piled up over time, every rude comment, every glance that said, "You don't belong here," had worn her down. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. This time, she was going to make them see her. She couldn't change the world. Not by herself. But she could start by changing how she allowed it to treat her. Her brother's voice echoed in her mind. The one thing that always managed to pull her back from the edge when she doubted herself. You can't let people define you. Nina, you have more to offer than they can ever see. It was true. She had more to offer. She had always known that deep down. But somewhere along the way, she had buried that part of herself in the endless struggle to survive. She stood up, the sound of her boots hitting the pavement like a small declaration. She didn't know what she would do next. Maybe she would go back to that restaurant and confront the manager. Maybe she wouldn't, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep letting life pass her by without ever standing up for herself. It was time for a change. And it was going to start with her. As she turned to walk back into the store, Nina's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up across the street. A familiar face stepped out, one she hadn't seen in years. It was Clara, her old friend from high school, the girl who had always been a little too rich. A little too perfect, but who had somehow been her friend anyway. Clara's bright smile had always been genuine, though, but now, seeing her again after so much time, Nina felt a strange wave of unease wash over her. What had happened to her old friend? What would she say when she saw Nina? Would Clara even remember the girl who had sat in the back row of class? Too shy to speak up? Too invisible to be noticed? Nina took a deep breath, bracing herself as Clara's gaze finally landed on her. Nina sat in the dim glow of the store's fluorescent lights, her hands moving mechanically over the register as she rang up a steady stream of customers. The hum of the scanner, the rustle of paper bags, the clink of coins, it was all part of the rhythm of her life. Yet today, something felt off. The heaviness in her chest from earlier that morning hadn't quite lifted. And every now and then, her mind drifted back to the restaurant. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The sting of the manager's words, the cold dismissal, the feeling of being so easily pushed aside. It had been more than just a comment on her clothes, it was the silent, invisible barrier that divided people like her from the ones who mattered. The ones who belonged. It was the same feeling she'd gotten when she first came to this country, like she wasn't enough. Like she was invisible. But it was one thing to feel invisible, and another to have someone put it into words so plainly, so cuttingly. Nina's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up another customer's purchases. She was angry at herself for letting it get to her. But she couldn't help it. She wanted to scream. After she finished the transaction, Nina grabbed her things and walked toward the break room, needing a moment to collect herself. The small, narrow room was silent except for the buzzing of the old refrigerator in the corner. She sank into the worn chair in front of the table, staring at the wall. Her breath came faster than it should, and she clutched her fists, the nails digging into the palms of her hands. Why had she gone along with it? Why hadn't she said anything? She replayed the moment over and over, as if some part of her had hoped the outcome would change with each passing thought. What had stopped her from speaking up? She hadn't even told them why she was there, what she needed. The words had caught in her throat, like something heavy and stuck. She couldn't get them out. Her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of one of the managers. Karen, who poked her head in the break room door. Nina, can you come out front? We've got a situation. Nina exhaled slowly, pushing her frustration deep down inside. It wasn't the time to show how unsettled she was. Not here, not now. She stood up, smoothing down the front of her shirt, and walked back to the floor. The usual buzz of customers and chatter filled the air as she walked toward the register. Her face carefully composed. She could already feel the eyes on her. The usual coldness from the regulars. The indifferent nods of recognition. She forced a smile, but as she stepped behind the counter, she was immediately confronted by the sight of the manager. Greg, leaning against the countertop with a half-smile on his face, arms crossed. His expression was the same one he wore when he knew he had power. The kind of expression that made Nina's stomach twist into knots. Hey, Nina, we need to have a talk, Greg said, his voice casual but laced with an unmistakable edge. Nina felt her pulse quicken. About what? She asked, her voice a little too sharp, a little too tight. Greg glanced over at her, eyes scanning her face. The thing is, we have rules here, Nina, he began, his tone dripping with condescension. We can't just let anyone walk in and expect to be treated like VIPs. You know that, right? It's about maintaining a certain atmosphere. She blinked, trying to process what he was saying, the words circling in her mind. Are you? Nina paused, the words just on the tip of her tongue. Are you telling me I don't belong here? She wasn't sure where the question had come from, but the irritation in her chest forced it out. Despite her better judgment, Greg's smile didn't waver, but the tightness in his posture said it all. It's not about belonging. It's about following the rules. And if you can't follow them, he trailed off, allowing the unspoken threat to hang in the air between them. Nina swallowed hard. Her thoughts raced. the internal conflict raging in her mind. She wasn't one to stir up trouble. She wasn't one to make waves. But something in the way Greg was looking at her, like she didn't matter. Like she was disposable, lit a fire inside her. Something that had been burning for years but was now coming to the surface. "Is that what you think of me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I don't matter? That I'm just..." She stopped herself before the words came tumbling out too quickly. Greg's eyes flickered for a brief moment. A flash of something behind his cool exterior. But it quickly vanished. "You're here to do your job, Nina," he said, his voice sharp now. "That's it, just do your job." She wanted to shout at him, to tell him exactly what she thought. But she didn't. Instead, she just nodded. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She was trapped. As she turned to walk away, she saw a man standing near the door, watching the scene unfold. He was a regular customer, someone she had seen around a few times. His name was Thomas, though she didn't know much about him beyond the fact that he usually came in to buy coffee and pastries. This time, his gaze didn't seem like it usually did. This time, there was something in his eyes, something that made her pause. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment, it was something else. Compassion, maybe, or understanding. But he didn't speak. He didn't say a word. Nina glanced away quickly, her stomach twisting again. She didn't need anyone's pity, especially not from someone like him. But it lingered, that look, long after she had walked past him, long after the door had closed behind her. She walked back into the break room, her mind spinning. What was she supposed to do now? What was she supposed to say? She knew she should have stood up for herself. She knew she should have said something. But what? What could she possibly say to make him see her? Her mind kept racing as she sat down on the worn chair again. But deep down, she knew she couldn't let it go. Not this time. She didn't know what her next move would be. But she couldn't let herself stay silent forever. Nina's mind was clouded as she worked through the evening shift, trying to drown out the nagging thoughts that had followed her all day. She moved mechanically, her fingers numb to the motions of scanning groceries and bagging them. The faint sound of chatter in the background, the soft hum of the fridge, the faint ringing of the register, it all blended together, forming a dull monotony that had become her life. But beneath the surface, there was something stirring, something deeper than the exhaustion. She couldn't shake the memory of that manager's condescending tone. His words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, steady and persistent. The coldness of his dismissal had struck her harder than she cared to admit. She hadn't realized how much that brief moment at the restaurant had affected her until she returned to work and felt herself withdrawing more than usual. It wasn't just the words, it was the realization that she wasn't seen. That the world would never recognize her for anything more than what she appeared to be, a worker. Invisible, just another face in the crowd. It wasn't just her place of work. It was everywhere, on the streets, in the faces of customers, in the way people avoided eye contact. Nina had grown used to it. But today, for some reason, it felt like a weight she could no longer bear. Her mind was elsewhere when the moment came, when the spark of something bigger than herself began to flicker into existence. A woman, a regular customer who often came in to grab a coffee in the mornings, stood near the counter as Nina was finishing up with the previous customer. The woman, oblivious to Nina's state of mind, asked if she could get a little help with the self-checkout. Nina's eyes flicked up from the register, momentarily distracted. Without thinking, she nodded and moved toward the station to assist. But that was when it happened. As Nina helped the woman, a young man, one of her co-workers, stepped up behind her, holding his phone in his hand. It wasn't unusual for him to be casually browsing. But this time, his attention was on Nina and the woman. He'd been standing idly by, just watching the exchange. What Nina didn't know was that, in a brief moment, he had caught the tail end of something, the exact moment when the woman had asked for assistance and Nina, as usual, had given it, trying to make the process easier for the customer. However, as the woman made a joke about Nina's helpful attitude, something shifted. The man, with his phone still pointed in their direction, had snapped a picture. The woman laughed softly, and Nina, still caught in her own thoughts, didn't realize what had happened. But moments later, the man had taken the photo, added a quick caption, and posted it on social media. Just had the most helpful cashier at the convenience store today. You know, the kind of helpful that feels a little too eager. Hashtag overqualified, hashtag customer favors, hashtag small town service. The hashtags hung in the air, unspoken, but the implications were clear. Nina froze when she saw the notification pop up on her phone. She hadn't been looking for it, hadn't even thought about checking her notifications, but something tugged at her, pulling her into the maelstrom she couldn't avoid. Her heart sank. The post was already gaining traction, with several comments and likes from people she didn't know. The words on the screen blurred, but one comment stood out from the rest. Just another example of customer service trying to win a gold star for doing their job. Get over it, dude. The feeling of humiliation washed over her in waves. She wasn't sure if it was the post itself or the realization that, in someone's eyes, she was just another thing to comment on. She was no longer a person to them. Just a joke, a funny little detail in someone else's day. And that detail, that image of her, was now out there for anyone to see. Her phone buzzed again. She checked the screen, the red dots indicating more notifications, more comments. Her hands trembled as she read through them. She recognized a few names. Regular customers who'd walked by her every day and never once acknowledged her presence. One comment, from a local, read, why do people act like this? Just trying to make a few bucks. And now she's being made fun of. Shame on the manager for letting this happen. Nina's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized that her actions, her simple attempts to help a customer, had turned into something so much larger than she had ever imagined. The post wasn't just a snapshot of her service, it was an indictment of her existence. A reminder that she was still, in the eyes of some, a person to be reduced to a stereotype, to be written off with a simple hashtag. As she stood there, frozen, her mind raced with 1,000 questions. What had she done wrong? Why was this happening to her? Why couldn't she just do her job without someone twisting it into something else? And in that moment, as the discomfort and shame rippled through her, Nina realized something. She had been pushed so far, and she was finally beginning to break. But it wasn't going to be in silence. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to be the punchline of some cruel joke anymore. She looked up from the screen and caught sight of Karen, the store manager. Across the room, Karen was talking to someone at the front counter. But she wasn't looking at Nina. It was as if Nina's very presence didn't matter. It felt like a slap in the face. Karen, who had never truly supported her, now stood as a passive observer to this entire ordeal. Just another part of the system that perpetuated her invisibility. The tension in Nina's chest grew, pressing down on her with every breath. The post, the comments, the humiliation, it all crashed in on her. And somewhere deep down, she knew something was shifting. She was no longer content to stand idly by, to take the backseat in her own life. The spark had been lit, and there was no going back. But Nina didn't know yet what this moment would cost her. She didn't know how it would unfold. But she could feel it. The weight of something big, something important, was on the horizon. The fluorescent lights in the office buzzed as Nina sat across from Mr. Greenfield, the restaurant's general manager. He sat behind his desk, hands folded neatly in front of him, looking at her with an expression that seemed far too practiced to be genuine. There was an air of formality in the room that made Nina feel even smaller than she already did. The walls were bare except for a few prints of abstract art that did nothing to ease the tension she felt. Nina had been summoned to this meeting under the pretense that it was about her performance. But she knew better. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. The realization that her life, her existence in that small restaurant, was being judged. Once again, "Thank you for coming in, Nina," Mr. Greenfield said, his voice smooth but distant. "We need to talk about your behavior recently. It's come to our attention that you've been acting in a way that's been disruptive to the atmosphere of the restaurant. I don't know if you're aware, but there's been a lot of attention around your recent interactions with customers." Nina nodded slowly, fighting the lump in her throat. She knew exactly what he was talking about, but she refused to let him see how much it hurt. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I was just doing my job." Mr. Greenfield didn't look convinced. "Doing your job is one thing. But what we're seeing here is something else. He paused, his eyes narrowing. We have a reputation to uphold. Nina, we can't have employees acting like this. People come here to feel comfortable, to feel like they belong. And your actions. He was cut off as the door to the office swung open without warning. Nina's head snapped toward the entrance, surprised to see a tall man in a well-tailored suit standing in the doorway. He wasn't anyone she recognized from the restaurant, but there was something about him, his presence, that immediately commanded attention. The man stepped into the room, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before settling on Mr. Greenfield. I'm sorry for the interruption, the man said, his voice calm but firm. But I need to speak with Nina. Mr. Greenfield blinked, clearly taken aback by the intrusion. Excuse me, do you have an appointment? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Nina with a kind smile, one that didn't feel rehearsed. Unlike Mr. Greenfield's, I'm Robert Cunningham, he said, extending his hand toward Nina. I believe we've met briefly before. I was here last week with a group of colleagues. Nina's brow furrowed as she shook his hand, still not sure who he was or why he was here. You don't have to worry about him, Robert continued, nodding toward Mr. Greenfield. I'm the one who's been reviewing the footage of what happened in this restaurant. You see, I was here the other day when you were working, and I watched the interaction from a table not far from where you were. Nina's heart skipped a beat. She could already feel the heat rising in her face. Had he seen everything? Had he seen how she'd been humiliated by the manager's words? I was appalled by what I saw, Robert continued. The way you were treated wasn't just unprofessional, it was outright disrespectful. And I know for a fact that the kind of treatment you received isn't something that should be allowed to happen. Especially not here, not in a place like this, where people come for more than just food, they come for the experience. And that experience includes being treated with dignity, something you weren't afforded. Nina's mind raced. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved, confused, or overwhelmed. A man she didn't even know had witnessed her humiliation. And now he was talking about standing up for her. But why? Why was he doing this? Robert glanced over at Mr. Greenfield, who had been standing silently in the corner, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. I've already spoken with the higher-ups about this, Robert said, and I've made it clear that I won't stand by while people like Nina are treated this way. I've decided that I'm going to help her. Nina's head spun. Help her? What did that even mean? I'm going to help Nina get the recognition she deserves, Robert continued, turning back to face her directly. And I'm going to make sure the people responsible for what happened to her are held accountable. There was something about the way Robert spoke that made her want to believe him. To trust that he wasn't just offering empty words. His voice had a weight to it, a conviction that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, someone cared. Maybe someone saw her. I don't know what to say, Nina whispered, the overwhelming emotions threatening to spill out of her. She hadn't expected this, not in a million years. She had thought that if she just let it go, it would all fade into the background. But here was someone, a complete stranger, telling her that he believed in her. You don't have to say anything, Robert replied gently. You've already done more than enough by showing up here, by not letting them silence you. And that's what I admire about you. Nina stared at him, unsure of what to feel. She had been used to fighting alone, used to being dismissed and ignored. But now, standing in front of her was someone who wasn't trying to look past her. He was looking at her, truly seeing her. I'm going to make sure that what happened here doesn't go unnoticed, Robert said, his voice firm. And you'll see, Nina, you won't have to fight this battle on your own. For the first time that day, Nina felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. Just a little. She wasn't alone anymore. Nina sat in the small, sterile break room of the restaurant, her hands clasped tightly around the mug of lukewarm coffee in front of her. The space was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. She had been here before, countless times, tired, frustrated, and defeated. But today, there was something different about the air around her. Something was shifting, something she couldn't ignore. She had been summoned by Mr. Greenfield, the restaurant's general manager, just hours after her unexpected meeting with Robert Cunningham, the man who had taken an interest in her case. She had been offered something she hadn't expected, a chance to participate in an internal investigation into the restaurant's operations. At first, The idea had felt like a stroke of fortune, a way for her to have a voice in the very system that had mistreated her. But as the details started to unfold, Nina realized this was not as simple as she had hoped. The investigation wasn't about uncovering the truth. It wasn't about justice. No, it was about saving face. About maintaining a reputation that had been built on the backs of people like Nina. The investigation was a facade, a way to placate the growing complaints and the viral attention that had surrounded the recent events. But in her gut, Nina knew something else. She knew the truth would be swept under the rug, just like it had always been. And as she sat there, waiting for her next instructions, the weight of her decision began to settle in. Her phone buzzed with a new message, pulling her from her thoughts. It was from Robert Cunningham. "How are you holding up? I know this is hard, but you're doing the right thing." Nina's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she typed a quick reply. "I'm trying to do what's right. But I'm scared of what will happen next." The words felt hollow, even to her. What if she made the wrong choice? What if the consequences of speaking out were too great? Her heart raced as she considered the warning that had been given to her by Mr. Greenfield and others higher up in the organization. If she exposed the restaurant's inner workings, if she revealed the truth about how customers were treated based on their status and how employees were used as pawns in a game they could never win, she would be risking everything. Her job, her livelihood, her reputation. But something inside Nina was stirring. A quiet voice growing louder with every passing moment. She had fought so hard to get to this point. She couldn't stop now, not when she had the opportunity to do something that might actually make a difference. She wasn't just another employee anymore. She was someone who could speak up for the others who had been silenced for so long. She could be the voice for those who were too afraid to speak out. The door to the break room opened suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. It was Karen, the store manager, who stepped inside, her usual stern expression softened by the unease in her eyes. "Nina, you need to come with me," Karen said quietly. There was no bravado in her tone this time. Nina followed Karen out of the break room, through the narrow hallway, and into Mr. Greenfield's office. Mr. Greenfield was sitting behind his desk, his hands resting on the surface in front of him. His gaze flicked to Nina as she entered, a glimmer of something unreadable in his eyes. For a moment, the weight of the room seemed to press down on her, suffocating her, but she stood tall, determined not to let him see the uncertainty that still gnawed at her. "Please, sit down," Mr. Greenfield said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Nina lowered herself into the chair, her back straight, her hands still trembling slightly despite her attempts to keep them still. "We've decided to go forward with the investigation," Mr. Greenfield began, his voice cold and detached, as if he was talking about something trivial. "You will be assisting in reviewing customer complaints, as well as documenting staff feedback on the way the restaurant has been managed." Nina nodded, though her heart wasn't in it. She had seen enough to know that this was just a move to placate the public. They were more interested in sweeping the issues under the rug than actually solving them. "But," Mr. Greenfield continued, his tone shifting, becoming sharper, more threatening, "you need to understand that if you decide to go too far, if you push this investigation to places we don't want it to go, you'll be the one who faces the consequences." The words hit her like a slap across the face. Nina's stomach clenched, and she felt the familiar pang of fear rising inside her. She had always been careful, always tried to stay below the radar. But now, with every word Mr. Greenfield spoke, it felt like he was trying to intimidate her into submission. "Do you understand?" he asked, his gaze piercing. Nina's throat went dry. She nodded, but in her heart, she was screaming. Was it worth it? Was it worth risking everything for the sake of justice? "What's the worst that could happen?" she whispered to herself. But it wasn't a question, it was a plea for reassurance. She didn't have the answers. Not yet. The room was silent for a long moment, and Nina's mind raced. She thought of her brother, her only family left. What would happen to him if she lost her job? How would they survive? How would she survive? "Listen, Nina," Mr. Greenfield said, breaking the silence. "We're giving you an opportunity here. But you need to play by the rules. The way this business runs is the way it runs for a reason. Don't forget that." Nina looked at him, his eyes full of expectation, full of the kind of power that she had learned to fear over the years. But this time, she didn't flinch. "I won't forget," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. As she walked out of Mr. Greenfield's office, the door clicking shut behind her, Nina's mind was a whirlwind of uncertainty and fear. But one thing was clear: she couldn't back down now. She had a choice to make: the truth or silence. And no matter the cost, she was ready to face it. Nina sat in the small office, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of the desk, her heart beating erratically in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for so long. She had gathered the evidence, the testimony, the pieces of the puzzle that would finally expose the truth about the restaurant. Her hands were clammy, her mind racing through the possible outcomes. But there was no going back now. It was a strange feeling. This mixture of fear and resolve. She had known, deep down, that something had to change. The whispers from the staff, the way customers were treated based on their perceived status, the way she had been humiliated not so long ago, it all pointed to a culture of disregard, of injustice. She had seen it firsthand, experienced it firsthand. Now, it was time for everyone else to see it, too. The door opened, breaking her thoughts, and in walked Robert Cunningham. Nina didn't need to ask why he was there. She had received a call earlier in the day, a message that seemed too good to be true. Robert had decided to take action. He wasn't just a bystander anymore, he had joined her cause. His influence now behind her. "Ready?" Robert asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight of anticipation. He didn't ask for her permission, nor did he need to. His actions over the past few days had already spoken volumes, making it clear that he was prepared to go all the way for what was right. Nina nodded, her mouth dry, her body tense. She hadn't known what to expect when she had started this journey. But now that the moment had arrived, she was gripped by a sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been overlooked, silenced, and ignored. "Let's do this," she whispered, more to herself than to Robert. They walked down the hallway toward the conference room where the board members were waiting. Nina's steps were steady, but her mind was in turmoil. She had dreamed of this moment for weeks, had visualized it countless times. But now, facing the reality of the confrontation, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Robert gave her a small, reassuring smile as they entered the room. The board members sat around the long, polished table, all of them looking up as they entered. Mr. Greenfield was there, his posture rigid, his face tight with irritation. He clearly hadn't expected Nina to come back with anything of consequence. "Please, take a seat," Robert said, his voice smooth but commanding. Nina sat down, her hands folded in her lap. The air felt heavy, and for a moment, she was paralyzed by the thought of everything that could go wrong. She had been warned. After all, she had been told that her life would be ruined if she crossed the line. That her career, her reputation, her future would all be on the line if she pursued this. But she had already come this far. She wasn't backing down now. "I have something to show you," Nina said quietly, her voice surprisingly steady. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folder she had prepared: notes, printouts of customer complaints, evidence of discrepancies, and the damning video that had gone viral. She slid the folder across the table to Mr. Greenfield, who eyed it with a mix of disbelief and annoyance. His gaze flicked over to Robert, who sat back, his arms folded across his chest. Robert said nothing but made no attempt to hide his satisfaction. Nina watched as Mr. Greenfield's fingers trembled slightly as he flipped open the folder. She could see the realization starting to dawn on him. The understanding that this wasn't just a minor issue anymore. This was bigger. This was the truth. "Do you see it now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried the weight of everything she had been through. The way customers are treated, the way employees are overlooked and humiliated, it's all right there. There was a long, heavy silence. Mr. Greenfield said nothing, but the tension in the room was palpable. He shifted in his seat, trying to regain his composure. But it was too late. The truth was laid bare in front of everyone. Robert broke the silence. "You've made a mistake, Greenfield. The way you've run this place, the way you've treated your employees, this can't go on. It's time for accountability." Mr. Greenfield's face flushed with anger. But it was clear that the room had already begun to turn. The board members were shifting in their seats, exchanging uncomfortable glances. The truth was out, and there was no denying it. "You think you can just waltz in here and accuse me of," Mr. Greenfield began. But Robert's voice cut him off. "No," Robert said firmly. "You think you can get away with mistreating people, with exploiting them for your own gain. But you've made a mistake. And now you're going to pay for it." The atmosphere in the room shifted again. Nina felt a small spark of something, relief, perhaps, flicker inside her chest. She had been waiting for this moment where the truth finally came to light. And now, it was happening. But it wasn't just about winning. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about getting back at Mr. Greenfield or the system that had kept her silent for so long. It was about something bigger. It was about making sure that this didn't happen to anyone else. It was about standing up and saying, "This isn't right," and knowing that, finally, someone was listening. As the conversation turned to discussions of how to handle the fallout, Nina sat quietly. She didn't need to say anything more. The truth had already been spoken. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was heard. The board members, who had once been so confident in their ability to control the narrative, were now scrambling. There was no easy way out. No cover-up that would work. Nina had taken her stand, and the walls that had once kept her trapped began to crumble. And as she left the room, the weight of the day beginning to sink in, Nina realized something. It wasn't about revenge. It was about change. It was about making a difference. And she had just begun. Nina stood by the window of her small apartment, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a quiet contrast to the storm of emotions still brewing inside her. It had been a few weeks since the ordeal had unfolded, since the evidence was presented. The truth was exposed, and the house of cards had come crashing down. She had won. That much was clear. The restaurant had been forced to confront its deep-rooted biases and unethical practices. And the management had been called to account. But it wasn't about the victory. It wasn't about her getting her job back, or even the public apology that followed. It was about something much larger, something that could ripple through her community, her world. But it was also more complicated than that. She had become a symbol of justice, of standing up for what was right. But Nina knew she was far from the only one who had been mistreated. There were countless others out there, people like her, who had been crushed under the weight of unfair systems, silenced by those who held power over them. Her journey wasn't just hers. It was everyone's. She thought back to the day she had stood in that conference room, laying bare the truth. She had felt so small in that moment, so insignificant. But now, weeks later, the feeling had shifted. She wasn't small anymore. She was a catalyst for change, a whisper in the chaos that had become a roar. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her brother, Carlos, who had been quietly supportive through the whole ordeal. "Can we talk tonight? I've got something to share." Nina smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. She hadn't expected her brother's support to be so unwavering. But it had been. He had seen the battle from the sidelines. But now, it seemed, he had something of his own to contribute. The message lingered in her mind as she sat down at her small dining table. Her hands ran over the old, worn surface, the one that had been with her through countless moments of joy and sorrow. It was here, at this table, that she had made the decision to fight, to not let the injustices she had experienced go unchallenged. It had started with the smallest of actions, a decision to raise her voice, to say, "No more." But now it felt as though a new chapter was unfolding. Nina's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find a woman standing there, a familiar face. "Are you Nina?" the woman asked, her voice hesitant but filled with something Nina recognized, hope. "Yes," Nina replied, her heart starting to beat faster. "Can I help you?" The woman introduced herself as Michelle, a former employee from the restaurant. She had left the place shortly after Nina had taken a stand. But her story was eerily similar. She had been subjected to the same treatment, the same subtle degradation. "I've been following everything," Michelle said, looking down at her feet for a moment before meeting Nina's gaze. "I don't know how to say this, but you gave me the courage to stand up, too." Nina blinked, surprised at the sudden rush of emotion that swelled in her chest. What do you mean? Michelle smiled faintly. I didn't think I had a voice. I didn't think anyone cared. But when I saw you, when I saw the strength it took for you to speak out, I realized I was wrong. I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could do the same. Nina stepped aside, gesturing for Michelle to come in. As the woman entered, Nina felt something stirring inside her. It was a feeling she had never expected, a sense of belonging, of solidarity. This was bigger than her. This was about the community. About showing the world that silence was no longer an option. They sat down together, and Michelle began to tell her story. As she spoke, Nina saw the same quiet defiance she had once felt. Michelle had been afraid, too, but she had taken the first step, just like Nina had. And now, they were here, together, each of them stronger than they had been before. After Michelle left, Nina sat quietly, her mind racing. She thought about her journey, about the hurdles she had faced. The people who had turned their backs on her, and the ones who had supported her. She thought about the small act of standing up, about how it had rippled outward, inspiring others to take a stand. Too, she had helped someone, but in doing so, she had helped herself as well. Her thoughts turned to the larger question, one that had lingered in the back of her mind from the very beginning. What about the system, the people who still controlled it, the ones who could keep others silent, keep others down? How many more would suffer before they, too, found the courage to stand up? Will this ever end? She whispered aloud. Or will we always be fighting? It was a question that didn't have an easy answer, but it was one Nina had to ask. Her victory hadn't just exposed a corrupt system, it had shown her the depth of the problem. And as much as she had fought for justice, she knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was alone. There were others out there, waiting for their moment, just like she had. The silence that followed the question wasn't one of defeat. It wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence of something beginning, something much larger than her. Something that would continue long after her own story had been told. And Nina knew that, in the end, that was enough. As Nina sat in the quiet of her apartment, watching the evening light fade away, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened, the triumphs, the losses, and the lessons learned. She had never set out to be a hero. But somewhere along the way, she had become one for herself, and for others who had silently suffered in the shadows. The truth is, injustice doesn't always wear a loud face. Sometimes, it's silent, subtle, hidden in the spaces between what's said and what's done. But standing up to it doesn't always require a grand gesture. Sometimes, it only takes a single voice, a small act of courage, to set everything in motion. And when that voice is heard, when one person chooses to speak up for what's right, the echoes can reverberate through the lives of so many others. So, the question remains. How many more voices are out there, waiting for their moment? And how many more moments will it take before we truly start listening? If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, a question, or even a quiet truth, please subscribe to Undercover Truths to walk with us through more untold journeys. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.